the heat was unbearable. Even at dawn, the air shimmered with a suffocating dryness that clung to everything. Dust floated like ash from a distant fire, swirling through the broken streets of the city. Buildings, once vibrant and full of life, now stood as crumbling monuments to a world that had long since burned itself out. Earth wasn't what it used to be. Global warming had turned it into a wasteland, and every step felt like trudging through an oven.
Once upon a time, in a world bursting with tales untold, there was a place where stories come to life, a place where the extraordinary became the everyday, and where every word carried you deeper into the unknown. This was not an ordinary place. It was a sanctuary for storytellers, dreamers, and wanderers alike. Welcome to All Things Storybound, where imagination has no limits and every tale takes you on an unforgettable journey. Here, we unravel mysteries, delve into the fantastic, and explore the depths of the human heart. So, whether you seek a gripping twist, a heartwarming revelation, or a world unlike any you've ever known, you're in the right place. Sit back, open your mind, and let us take you beyond the bounds of reality. Let the story begin.
Chapter 1.
Kai wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the small, dilapidated apartment he shared with Lena. He glanced at the water ration dangling from his belt, the small metal canister holding barely enough to get them through the day. Every sip was measured carefully, every drop of water a gift from the gods in a world where even the skies refused to give rain. His eyes scanned the streets, taking in the tired faces of the people around him. They were all like him, worn down, struggling to survive. Fear was the common thread that bound them. Fear of starvation, of dehydration, and most of all, fear of the lottery. It was the government's way of ensuring the survival of the fittest, though everyone knew it was just a brutal method to save resources. Every week, 20 names were drawn from the population, and those unlucky souls were executed, supposedly to reduce the burden on food and water. The rich, of course, were never on that list. Kai had never met a single person from the upper tiers who feared the lottery.
Another day in paradise.
He muttered to himself as he walked through the narrow alleyways, the sun already high enough to bake the cracked pavement beneath his feet. Lena was still asleep when he left. She had been working late shifts at the water filtration plant, a grueling job where most people didn't last long. But it was work, and in a world like theirs, any work that paid in rations was worth keeping. She was the only thing keeping him grounded, his one bright spot in a life of constant struggle. They'd been together for years, dreaming of a better life, though those dreams were beginning to feel as dry as the land around them. As Kai approached the market, the hollow faces of those lining up for their daily rations greeted him. Most had been standing for hours, hoping they'd get their hands on a few scraps before the vendors ran out. The food shortage was worse than ever. Crops had failed again, the last reserves dwindling. The government promised new shipments, but everyone knew those were reserved for the rich.
Kai!
A familiar voice called out. He turned to see Dax, his closest friend, waving from across the street. Dax looked as worn out as everyone else, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame, his face a little more hollow than the last time they'd spoken.
How's it looking today?
Kai asked as he joined him in line.
Same as always. People are getting desperate. I heard some folks tried to raid one of the warehouses last night. They didn't make it out alive.
Kai nodded, unsurprised. Anyone who crossed the government met a swift end, whether by the lottery or a bullet.
The lottery's tomorrow.
Dax continued, lowering his voice as if speaking the word itself could draw attention.
Think it'll be one of us?
Kai felt a cold dread creep into his gut. The lottery was always a shadow lurking in the background, but now it felt like it was reaching out to touch him personally. He hadn't allowed himself to think about it too much. What good would it do?
I don't know.
Kai answered, keeping his eyes fixed on the line ahead.
It's never the rich, though. They say it's random,
Dax said bitterly.
but we all know it's rigged.
Kai didn't respond. He didn't want to think about the system, or the whispers about the rebellion that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. He just wanted to survive. The line shuffled forward, inch by inch, as the vendors doled out their meager supplies. Kai's stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become a constant companion, one that dulled after a while. He was more concerned about the water rations. They hadn't had enough to drink in days. Finally, he reached the front. The vendor, a haggard old man with sunken eyes, glanced at Kai's ration card and slid a small bag of withered vegetables and a half-empty canister of water across the counter.
Next.
The vendor muttered without looking up. Kai took his supplies and turned to Dax, who had just finished collecting his own pitiful share.
You heading back? Not yet.
Dax replied.
I heard there's going to be a broadcast in the square. Probably more lies from the regime, but I want to hear what they've got to say this time.
Kai hesitated. He hated those broadcasts. The hollow promises of the government always left a sour taste in his mouth, but curiosity got the better of him.
All right,
He said.
I'll come with you.
They made their way toward the city square, where a large, cracked screen hung above the ruins of what had once been a government building. A crowd was already gathering, people murmuring as they waited for the broadcast to start. As the screen flickered to life, the city's emblem, a cracked sun over barren mountains, appeared, followed by the face of Governor Jared, the man who controlled everything within the city's walls. His sharp, polished features stood in stark contrast to the starving faces watching him. He looked well-fed, healthy even, which only fueled the simmering resentment among the crowd.
Citizens,
Governor Jared began, his voice amplified through speakers that crackled with static.
I come to you today with a message of hope.
Kai scoffed under his breath. Hope, that's what they called it now.
Our world has suffered, but we are resilient. Together, we have survived the worst of the famine. And now, I bring news of recovery. A new shipment of food will arrive in the coming weeks, ensuring that our city remains strong.
Dax crossed his arms, glaring at the screen.
Yeah, right. You think any of that's going to end up on our plates?
Kai didn't respond. It was the same speech they gave every month. Promises of food, of recovery, while the people starved and the rich grew fatter behind their gated communities.
But
Governor Jared continued, his tone shifting.
we must remain vigilant. Our resources are limited, and we must ensure that those resources go to the most deserving. The lottery will continue to take place tomorrow as scheduled, to ensure that our population remains sustainable. Remember, this sacrifice is for the greater good. Your contributions will be remembered as acts of heroism.
The crowd tensed. The mention of the lottery always did that. The promise of a food shipment meant nothing when the lottery loomed over everyone's head like a death sentence. Kai's heart sank. He thought of Lena, still sleeping in their apartment. He couldn't imagine losing her, not now, not when she was the only thing keeping him grounded. The screen flickered off, and the crowd began to disperse, muttering bitter curses under their breath. Dax turned to Kai, his face grim.
You should get home. Hold on to Lena tight tonight. You never know whose name's going to be on that list.
Kai nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. The lottery was random, they said, but it never felt random. It was always the poor, the weak, the ones who couldn't fight back. And tomorrow, it could be Lena.
I'll see you later, Dax.
Kai said, turning away from the square. As he walked back to the apartment, the tension gnawed at him. He had seen too many people lose their loved ones to the lottery. Friends, neighbors, strangers. Every week, the names were read aloud in the square, and every week, the executions followed swiftly after. There was no time to mourn, no chance to fight back. When he opened the door to the apartment, Lena was already awake, sitting at the small table they'd managed to scavenge months ago. She looked up, her soft brown eyes tired but full of warmth as she smiled at him. "How was it out there?"
Same as always.
Kai replied, setting the rations on the table.
The lottery's tomorrow.
Lena's smile faded. She nodded, her face tightening with worry.
We'll be fine,
She said quietly, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her fear.
it won't be us.
Kai wanted to believe her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that they were safe, that they'd make it through another week unscathed. But he couldn't shake the dread that had settled in his gut since hearing the governor's words.
I hope so.
He said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Her skin was warm against his, a small comfort in the cold, uncertain world they lived in.
I don't know what I'd do if I lost you.
Lena smiled again, though this time it was tinged with sadness.
You won't lose me, Kai. We're stronger than that.
They sat in silence for a moment, both of them knowing that strength didn't matter when it came to the lottery. The system didn't care how strong you were, how much you loved, or how hard you fought. It only cared about survival, its own twisted version of survival. That night, as they lay together in the dark, the weight of the unknown pressed down on them both. Tomorrow, everything could change.
Chapter 2.
The sun was barely rising when Kai woke the next morning, but already the heat pressed down, heavy and relentless. His throat was dry, but he resisted the urge to take another sip from his water ration. They had to make it last. Lena was still asleep, her breath slow and steady beside him. Kai watched her for a moment, feeling the familiar ache of worry tugging at his chest. Today was the day. The lottery would be drawn this afternoon. Kai tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. They had survived so many lotteries before. Why should this one be any different? But then he remembered how many times he'd seen others say the same thing, only to have their names read aloud in the square. The government didn't care about fairness, only maintaining control. He slipped out of bed quietly, trying not to disturb Lena, and went to the small window that overlooked the narrow alley below. The city stretched out in front of him, a maze of crumbling buildings and broken streets, each one filled with people who were just trying to survive. He could already hear voices drifting up from the streets below. People murmuring anxiously about the lottery, speculating about who might be next. Kai rested his forehead against the cool glass, feeling the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. There was nothing he could do. If one of their names was chosen, that was it. There were no appeals, no second chances. You couldn't run, couldn't hide. The government would find you. Behind him, he heard Lena stirring.
You're up early,
she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep.
Couldn't sleep.
Kai replied without turning around.
It's today.
Lena didn't answer right away, but he could hear her moving around behind him. A few moments later, he felt her arms wrap around his waist as she rested her head against his back.
It won't be us,
she whispered. Kai wanted to believe her. He wanted to cling to the hope that they would be spared, that their names would be overlooked once again. But the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface.
I'll head out early.
Kai said, finally turning to face her.
Maybe we can get an extra water ration if I get to the market before it gets too crowded.
Lena nodded, though they both knew the chances of getting extra rations were slim. The government's distribution was as rigid as it was cruel. Still, any hope was better than none. The walk to the market was quiet, the usual buzz of conversation muted by the weight of the day. Everyone was thinking about the same thing, the lottery. Children clung to their parents' hands, their eyes wide with fear, while adults kept their heads down, trying to pretend they weren't terrified. As Kai approached the ration station, he noticed a group of soldiers standing off to the side, their faces impassive beneath their helmets. The government's presence had been growing more obvious over the past few months. More patrols. More checkpoints. It was a reminder to everyone that resistance was futile, that the regime was always watching. The line for rations moved slowly, each person taking their allotted share and shuffling off without a word. When Kai reached the front, The vendor didn't even glance up as he slid a small bag of dried grains and a half-empty canister of water across the counter. Kai took the supplies and turned to leave when a loud voice boomed through the square.
Attention, citizens.
Everyone froze, heads snapping toward the source of the voice. A government official stood on a raised platform, flanked by soldiers. His uniform was immaculate, his face cold and detached as he looked out over the crowd.
The lottery will begin in 1 hour.
The official announced.
All citizens are required to report to the square. Failure to comply will result in immediate punishment.
Kai's stomach twisted. The announcement hung in the air like a death sentence, the fear palpable among the crowd. He glanced around, seeing the same look of dread mirrored on every face. He made his way back home quickly, his heart racing as the clock ticked closer to the inevitable. When he entered the apartment, Lena was already waiting, her face pale.
"They just made the announcement,"
she said quietly. Kai nodded, setting the rations down on the table.
We should get going. They'll be starting soon.
The walk to the square felt like a march toward execution. The streets were packed with people, all of them moving in the same direction, their faces grim and silent. Lena walked beside him, her hand gripping his tightly, but neither of them spoke. When they reached the square, it was already overflowing with people, all standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their fate. The large screen that usually broadcasted the governor's messages was now displaying a blank, flickering background. Soldiers lined the edges of the crowd, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, as if to remind everyone that escape wasn't an option. Kai and Lena found a spot near the back of the crowd, where they stood quietly, holding hands. Kai's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the countdown to the drawing. Finally, the screen flickered to life, and Governor Gerard's face appeared, looking down on them like a deity passing judgment. His expression was as composed as ever, his voice smooth and authoritative.
Citizens of the city, today we honor the sacrifice of 20 brave souls who will ensure the survival of the many. This is not an easy task, but it is a necessary one. You should take comfort in knowing that your contributions will be remembered. The lottery begins now.
The screen shifted to display a long list of names, and the tension in the crowd reached a fever pitch. A mechanical voice began reading the names aloud, each one striking like a blow to the chest. Kai held his breath, every fiber of his being focused on the names. Each time the voice called out a new one, he silently thanked whatever higher power there was that it wasn't his, that it wasn't Lena's, until it was.
Lena Hallstrom.
The voice echoed through the square, cutting through the air like a blade. Kai felt his blood run cold. His heart stopped. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. Beside him, Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her face went white.
"No,"
she whispered.
"No, no, no, no."
Kai's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. Not Lena. Not her. The voice continued reading names, but Kai didn't hear any of them. His world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Lena's name, hanging in the air like a death sentence.
No!
Kai shouted, grabbing Lena's arm.
We have to go. We have to run.
Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
"They'll find me, Kai. They'll find me."
I don't care.
He shouted.
We're not letting them take you.
But before they could move, soldiers were already pushing through the crowd, making their way toward them. Lena's grip on his hand tightened.
"Kai,"
she said, her voice shaking.
"you have to let me go."
Kai's chest tightened, and his heart pounded in his ears.
I won't.
He said, his voice breaking.
I can't.
The soldiers reached them.
Lena Hallstrom.
One of them said coldly, stepping forward and pulling her from Kai's grasp.
You've been chosen. Come with us.
Lena didn't fight. She didn't resist. She only looked at Kai with tear-filled eyes as they led her away.
"I love you,"
she whispered before she disappeared into the crowd.
Chapter 3.
Kai stood frozen in the square, his legs weak beneath him as he watched the soldiers drag Lena away. Her voice echoed in his mind, "I love you." She hadn't fought, hadn't screamed, hadn't tried to run. Because she knew, just as he did, that it was futile. The lottery was absolute. No one escaped it. The crowd around him began to disperse, their faces downcast, avoiding his gaze. The executions wouldn't take place until tomorrow, but everyone knew what was coming. The chosen never returned. The government made sure of that. 20 lives gone by sunrise.
Kai, I'm so sorry.
It was Dax, his voice low and full of sorrow as he came up beside Kai, placing a hand on his shoulder.
I don't know what to say.
Kai didn't respond. His throat felt tight, his chest constricted. He couldn't breathe. The world was spinning around him, every sound muffled as if he were underwater. All he could see was Lena's face, the terror in her eyes as they led her away. It wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had worked tirelessly, kept her head down, obeyed the rules. And still, the system had chosen her, plucking her from his life like she meant nothing. Like she was just another name on a list.
I should have stopped them.
Kai whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. Dax shook his head, his grip tightening on Kai's shoulder.
There was nothing you could do. You know that.
Kai's mind churned with a mix of rage and helplessness. How many times had he heard that before? Nothing you could do. It was the government's mantra, the lie they used to keep everyone in line. No one could fight the system. No one could stop the lottery because they were all too afraid. Fear had paralyzed them, kept them from realizing they had the power to resist. But Kai wasn't afraid anymore. Not after today. Fear had been replaced with something far more dangerous, anger.
I need to be alone.
Kai muttered, pulling away from Dax's grasp. His friend didn't try to stop him, only nodding silently as Kai turned and headed for the edge of the square. The walk home was a blur. His vision swam as tears burned in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. Not while the soldiers still patrolled the streets, watching for any sign of rebellion, any excuse to exert their power. When Kai finally reached the apartment, it felt empty, hollow. The silence echoed around him, pressing in on all sides. Lena's things were still scattered throughout the small space. The blanket she'd draped over the couch, the cup she'd left by the sink, the faded photograph of them that had somehow survived the years of famine and war. She was everywhere, and yet she was already gone. Kai sat down at the table, staring blankly at the ration card still sitting there from the morning. How could life have changed so quickly? How could they have gone from planning their future together to this? He'd lost the only person who had given him hope, and the government had taken her like she was nothing. The anger inside him simmered, bubbling up until he could barely contain it. It wasn't just Lena. It was everyone. The entire city, living in constant fear of the regime, trapped in a system designed to keep them weak and compliant. They lived and died by the whims of a government that didn't care about them, and no one ever fought back. But maybe it was time someone did. Kai clenched his fists, the heat of his rage giving him the strength to stand, to move. He couldn't sit here, wallowing in his grief. He had to do something. He had to make this mean something. With a shaky breath, he left the apartment again, his mind spinning with what little he knew of the rebellion. There were whispers, rumors of groups gathering in secret to fight against the regime, to overthrow the lottery system. But they were always underground, hidden away. The rebels couldn't afford to be seen, not with the government's soldiers everywhere. Still, Kai knew he had to find them. He had to try. He wandered the streets for hours, searching the alleyways and back corners of the city, listening for any hint of the rebellion. His heart raced with each step, unsure of what he was even looking for. All he knew was that he couldn't return to his old life. Not now, not without Lena. He had to fight back, had to find a way to make the regime pay for what they'd done to her. And then, just as the sun began to set, he found them. It happened almost by accident. Kai was walking through one of the more abandoned districts of the city, where buildings had long since crumbled and the government's patrols were sparse. He heard voices, low, hushed, urgent, and followed the sound down a narrow alley. There, hidden behind a collapsed wall, a small group of people huddled together, their faces grim but determined. They were dressed like ordinary citizens, but there was something different about them, something fierce in their eyes, something that set them apart from the rest of the city's defeated, hopeless population. Kai stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding.
I'm looking for the rebellion,
He said quietly, unsure if he was about to be turned away or worse. One of the figures, a tall woman with sharp features and a scar running down her cheek, stepped forward. She eyed Kai suspiciously, her hand resting on a knife strapped to her waist.
Who sent ya?
No one.
Kai said, swallowing hard.
I lost someone. To the lottery.
Her eyes softened slightly, though her guard didn't lower.
You're not the only one,
she said, her voice low and rough.
but this isn't a game, kid. If you're looking for revenge, you won't last long.
Kai clenched his fists at his sides.
I don't care about revenge.
He lied.
I want to stop them.
The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness or deception. Finally, she nodded and gestured for him to follow her.
You want to stop them?
She said as they walked deeper into the alley, the other rebels watching them carefully.
Then you're gonna have to learn how to fight.
Chapter 4.
The first thing Kai noticed was how quiet it was underground. He had followed the scarred woman through a series of narrow alleyways until they reached an old, rusted door, barely noticeable against the crumbling walls. Behind it, a hidden stairwell led down into the depths of the city, where the sound of the wind and the heat of the sun couldn't reach. It was like entering another world, a world where fear still hung in the air, but it was different here. Here, fear fueled action. As they descended the steps, Kai's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he set out to find the rebels, but this hidden, underground base felt like stepping into a story he didn't fully understand. A part of him still wondered if he was in over his head, but that voice was quickly drowned out by the need to do something, anything, to fight back. The woman stopped at the bottom of the stairs and knocked 3 times on a metal door. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with people. Some were sitting around a table, poring over maps and old tech equipment, while others leaned against the walls, their eyes sharp and alert. These weren't the starving, broken citizens Kai was used to seeing in the streets. These people were hardened, prepared. Fighters.
This is Mara,
the woman said, nodding toward Kai.
She runs things down here.
Kai's gaze shifted to the figure sitting at the head of the table, a tall, wiry woman with dark, calculating eyes and short cropped hair. She looked up from the map in front of her and raised an eyebrow, her gaze immediately piercing through Kai like she was weighing his soul.
Kai.
The scarred woman introduced him.
He's here because of the lottery. He wants to fight.
Mara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest.
Everyone here lost someone because of the lottery,
she said, her voice even and calm.
That doesn't make you special.
Kai bristled slightly at her words, but he kept his mouth shut. He was here to learn, not to argue.
What makes you think you can help us?
Mara asked, studying him with a cool, detached expression. Kai hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't come here with a grand plan or any real idea of what the rebels were capable of. He'd come because he had nothing left.
I don't know,
he admitted, his voice low.
But I need to do something. The regime, they took everything from me. From all of us.
Mara's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Kai thought she might turn him away. But then, with a slow nod, she stood up and walked toward him, her boots echoing softly against the concrete floor.
You want to fight?
She said, stopping in front of him.
Then you need to understand what that really means.
She turned to the rest of the room.
Get him suited up.
The next few days were a blur for Kai. He was handed weapons he barely knew how to use, shown how to move quietly through the shadows of the city, how to blend in when soldiers passed by, and how to think like a rebel. His instructors were cold, efficient No time for small talk or sympathy. Each day was grueling, filled with physical training and drills designed to teach him how to survive. And survival was the key. Mara made that clear every time she spoke.
This isn't about revenge,
She told him one night, after hours of weapons drills.
Revenge is emotional. It'll get you killed. You want to bring down the regime? You need to be smarter than that. You need to think about the bigger picture.
Kai nodded, though a part of him still held onto his rage. He wasn't like the others here, the ones who had been training for months or even years. He was still raw, still broken from Lena's death. But every time he thought of her name being called in the square, of the way she had been taken from him, it stoked the fire inside him. He needed that fire. He needed to hold onto it if he was going to make it through this. After a week of training, Kai was finally called in for a mission. It wasn't anything big, just a scouting mission, according to Mara, but it was enough to make his hands shake as he checked over his gear. The goal was simple: sneak into one of the regime's supply depots and gather intel on their food and water reserves. The government hoarded most of the resources, but the rebels had been working on ways to disrupt their supply chain. Mara didn't go with them. Instead, she sent the scarred woman, who Kai had learned was called Leela, and 2 other rebels, Nico and Jade. They were seasoned fighters, people who had been doing this long before Kai had even thought about rebellion. As they moved through the shadowed streets of the city, Kai tried to keep up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been trained, sure, but being out here, knowing that soldiers could appear at any moment, made everything feel more real. He wasn't ready for this, but he didn't have a choice anymore. They reached the supply depot just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the building. The depot was heavily guarded, more so than Kai had expected. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, and the gates were reinforced with heavy steel.
This is it,
Leela whispered, crouching beside him as they watched from a distance.
We just need to get in, take a look around, and get out. No heroics.
Kai nodded, though the tension in his muscles made it hard to focus. Nico and Jade moved first, slipping through a gap in the fence like ghosts. Leela followed, motioning for Kai to stay close behind. They moved quickly, their footsteps barely making a sound as they approached the side of the building. Kai's breath caught in his throat as they reached a side door. Nico pulled out a small device, some kind of tech that Kai had never seen before, and within seconds, the door clicked open. The rebels disappeared inside, leaving Kai to follow. The inside of the depot was a maze of crates and metal shelving, stacked high with supplies. It was more food and water than Kai had ever seen in one place, and the sight of it made his stomach twist with anger. This was what the regime hoarded, while people like him, like Lena, starved to death. Leela nudged him forward.
Stay focused,
She whispered.
We're here for intel, not supplies.
Kai nodded, trying to push his emotions down. They moved deeper into the depot, avoiding the patrolling guards as they made their way toward the back of the building. There, hidden behind stacks of crates, they found what they were looking for. Blueprints. Nico quickly scanned the documents, taking pictures with a small handheld device before signaling for them to leave. It was supposed to be an easy in and out mission. But nothing in this city was ever that simple. As they made their way back to the side door, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The guards were coming, their boots heavy on the concrete floor.
Move,
Leela hissed, shoving Kai toward the door. They bolted for the exit, but the guards were too close. As the door swung open, an alarm blared, and within seconds, the depot was swarming with soldiers. Kai's pulse skyrocketed. Everything was happening too fast. The sound of gunfire rang in his ears as they ran, darting through the shadows of the city, the soldiers hot on their trail.
keep going.
Leela shouted over the chaos, her voice sharp with urgency. Kai's legs burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they sprinted through the narrow alleyways. He could hear the soldiers behind them, their voices growing louder with each passing second. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't. The sound of a shot rang out, and Nico fell.
Chapter 5.
The crack of the gunshot seemed to echo endlessly through the narrow alley. Kai watched in horror as Nico crumpled to the ground, blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him. Time slowed for a moment, the world narrowing to the sight of Nico's lifeless body sprawled on the dirt. Kai's chest tightened, and a wave of nausea rolled over him.
Keep moving.
Leela's voice snapped him back to reality. She grabbed Kai by the arm, her grip hard enough to hurt as she yanked him forward.
We can't stop.
Kai stumbled, his legs heavy beneath him, but he forced himself to run. He wanted to scream, wanted to go back for Nico, but the sound of soldiers closing in drowned out everything else. There was no time. Jade was already several paces ahead, her face grim as she led the way through the twisting back streets. Kai and Leela followed close behind, hearts pounding, lungs burning as they darted through the maze of shadows and broken walls. Behind them, the soldiers were gaining ground. They took sharp turns, moving deeper into the city's underbelly, where the buildings were so decayed that even the regime didn't bother patrolling them regularly. The sound of boots and shouts slowly faded as they put more distance between themselves and the depot. Finally, when they reached the safety of a hidden tunnel entrance, Jade stopped and looked back at them. Her face was pale, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath.
We're clear for now.
Leela released Kai's arm and collapsed against the wall, her hand pressing to her side where blood trickled down from a deep gash. She hadn't said a word about the injury during the escape.
Damn it,
she muttered, her voice low with pain.
Nico.
Kai leaned against the opposite wall, his legs trembling, barely able to hold himself up. The guilt washed over him in waves, nearly drowning him.
I'm sorry.
He stammered.
I froze. If I hadn't...
It wasn't your fault,
Jade said, her tone sharp but not unkind.
Nico knew the risks. We all do.
Kai shook his head, his mind still spinning from the chaos. He had never seen someone die like that before, never been that close to death himself. The sound of the gunshot replayed in his head, over and over again, each time louder than before.
I shouldn't have come. I wasn't ready.
Leela winced as she pressed a bandage against her wound.
None of us were ready for this. But you're here now, and you can't go back.
Kai didn't respond. The reality of it all was crashing down on him. Joining the rebellion had seemed like the only way to make sense of Lena's death. But now, in the aftermath of the failed mission, he wasn't sure of anything. He wasn't sure if he could keep going, if he could be the kind of person who fought and killed and died for this cause. He'd lost Lena. He didn't want to lose himself too. By the time they made it back to the underground base, Kai's body felt like it was going to collapse. The tunnel led into a hidden room beneath the city, one of many secret hubs the rebels had set up to stay off the government's radar. It was cramped and dimly lit, but it was safe. For now. The others were already waiting when they arrived. Mara sat at the center of the room, her eyes narrowing as soon as she saw the look on Jade's face.
What happened?
She asked, her voice low and controlled.
Nico's dead,
Jade said bluntly, sinking into a chair.
The mission went south. We got the intel, but they were waiting for us on the way out.
A tense silence settled over the room. Kai could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, most of them probably thinking the same thing. The new guy couldn't handle it. Mara's gaze shifted to Leela, who was busy patching up her wound.
You should have pulled out sooner,
she said, her tone colder than before.
We lost a good fighter today.
Leela didn't respond. She was too busy trying not to wince as she cleaned her wound, but Kai could see the guilt flashing in her eyes. Mara's attention finally landed on Kai. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through him like she could see every thought swirling in his head.
And you, Kai? What did you learn today?
Kai swallowed hard, his mouth dry.
That I wasn't ready.
He admitted, his voice quiet but steady.
Nico died because of me.
Mara's lips tightened into a thin line.
Nico died because he was a fighter. Because this is war, and war is ugly. You weren't responsible for that.
But I froze.
Kai insisted, the frustration bubbling up.
I should have done something.
You survived,
Mara interrupted, her voice firm.
That's all that matters. We're not in this to win medals, Kai. We're in this to survive. Now you know what the real stakes are.
Her words hit him hard, but they didn't feel like comfort. They felt like cold, hard reality. In this world, survival was the only victory. But for Kai, survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. Lena had died. Nico had died, and what had they gained? A handful of blueprints. Another step in a war that felt more hopeless by the day. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting, not if it meant losing more people. Not if it meant becoming someone else entirely. The days after the failed mission passed in a blur of exhaustion and unease. The rebels were growing restless. News of Nico's death had spread quickly through the ranks, and whispers of doubt followed. There was tension in the air. Some rebels starting to question Mara's leadership, others wondering if they were losing the fight altogether. Kai stayed mostly to himself, still trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. He trained harder than ever, pushing himself to the brink, trying to force the fear and guilt out of his mind. But no matter how hard he worked, it never left him. Nico's death weighed on him, and the growing unrest among the rebels only made things worse. One evening, after a grueling day of drills, Kai overheard a conversation between two rebels as he walked through one of the tunnels.
She's losing it.
One of them muttered, their voice low and angry.
Mara's losing control.
I heard she's planning another big attack soon.
The other whispered.
But we're not ready. Not after losing Nico.
Kai's stomach twisted. He'd been sensing the growing tension, but hearing it said aloud made it feel even more real. The rebellion was hanging by a thread, and if things didn't change soon, it would all come crashing down. He didn't know where he stood in all of it. He had joined the rebels to fight back, but now he was beginning to wonder if they were even capable of winning. Was it all just a fool's errand? Was this fight only going to get more people killed? He thought of Lena, of the life they had dreamed of, escaping the city, finding a way to live outside the regime's control. But now, those dreams felt like distant memories, replaced by the harsh reality of war.
Hey.
A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Leela, her arm now bandaged but still clearly in pain. She leaned against the wall beside him, studying his face with her usual sharp gaze.
You've been quiet.
Kai shrugged.
Just trying to figure out what the hell I'm doing here.
Leela smirked, though there was no humor in it.
Welcome to the club.
Do you think we can win this?
Kai asked, the question heavy on his tongue. Leela didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the ceiling, her eyes distant.
I don't know,
she admitted finally.
But we have to try. If we stop fighting, we've already lost.
Kai nodded, though her words didn't bring the comfort he was hoping for. He wanted to believe that there was a future worth fighting for, that all the pain and loss would mean something in the end. But the doubts in his mind wouldn't go away, and neither would the feeling that something was coming. Something bigger than the rebellion, bigger than any of them.
Chapter 6.
The underground base was buzzing with nervous energy. The rebels moved quickly through the dimly lit corridors, checking weapons, distributing supplies, and muttering hurried conversations. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, a mixture of fear and anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. Mara had called for a full-scale assault. It was bold, dangerous, and far riskier than anything they'd attempted before. The target was one of the regime's critical supply hubs, a heavily fortified depot where the government stored most of the city's remaining food and water reserves. If the rebels could take it down, it would send a message that they weren't just a nuisance to the regime anymore. They were a real threat. But it was also a suicide mission. Kai stood off to the side, leaning against the cold, cracked wall as he watched the preparations unfold. His stomach churned with unease. The failed mission that had killed Nico was still fresh in his mind, And now Mara was pushing them into something even more dangerous. It didn't feel right.
You look like you're about to throw up.
Leela's voice cut through his thoughts. She had snuck up beside him, her usual sharpness softened by exhaustion. The bandage on her arm was still visible beneath her jacket, a constant reminder of the last mission's failure. Kai shook his head, trying to swallow the knot of fear lodged in his throat.
Do you think this is going to work?
He asked, keeping his voice low.
Taken on one of their main supply hubs after what happened with Nico?
Leela shrugged, her expression unreadable.
We don't have a choice. The regime's tightening its grip. People are starting to lose hope.
Kai looked around at the other rebels. They moved with purpose, but he could see it in their eyes, the fear, the doubt. They all knew the risks. And yet, here they were, preparing to go into battle again, because the alternative was worse.
If we don't do something soon,
Leela continued,
the rebellion will fall apart. Mara's just trying to keep us alive.
Alive?
Kai echoed, his voice bitter.
This feels more like a death sentence.
Leela smirked slightly, though there was no humor in it.
That's war, Kai. You're lucky if you make it out alive.
He didn't answer. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep doing this. Keep watching people die. Keep risking his own life for a fight that seemed more hopeless by the day. He had joined the rebellion because of Lena, because he wanted to make her death mean something. But now he wasn't sure if anything had meaning anymore. The more he fought, the more he lost. As Leela walked away to join the others, Kai felt a presence beside him. He glanced up to see Mara standing there, her gaze fixed on him.
You've been quiet,
she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. Kai stiffened. He had tried to avoid her since the failed mission, not sure if he could trust her judgment anymore. But now, with the next mission looming, there was no avoiding the conversation.
Do you think we can pull this off?
Kai asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Mara studied him for a moment, her dark eyes unreadable.
Do you?
Kai swallowed hard, the weight of her question hanging in the air between them.
I don't know,
he admitted.
I'm not sure if we're ready for something this big.
Mara's lips tightened into a thin line.
We don't have time to wait until we're ready. The regime isn't going to sit back and give us a chance to prepare. They're getting stronger, and we're running out of options. If we don't act now, there won't be a rebellion left to fight for.
Her words were cold, practical, exactly what Kai had come to expect from her. But that didn't make them any easier to hear.
And what if we fail?
Kai asked, his voice low.
What happens then?
Mara's gaze didn't waver.
Then we die fighting for something that matters.
The briefing for the mission took place in a cramped, windowless room at the heart of the underground base. Maps and blueprints were spread across the table, showing the layout of the supply hub, the guard rotations, and the weak points in the fortifications. The rebels gathered around, listening intently as Mara laid out the plan.
We'll move in under the cover of darkness,
Mara began, her voice steady and commanding.
There are two main objectives: sabotage their water reserves and to destroy the food storage facilities. Without these resources, the regime will be crippled, and it'll give us leverage to rally more people to our cause.
Kai stood at the back of the room, arms crossed as he listened. It sounded simple enough, but he knew better by now. Nothing about this fight was simple.
The depot is heavily guarded,
Mara continued, pointing to the main entrance on the map.
We'll split into two teams. Leela will lead the first team to sabotage the water supply. I'll take the second team and target the food storage. Both teams will plant explosives and get out before the guards can react.
There were murmurs of agreement from the rebels, but Kai could feel the tension in the room. No one was saying it, but they all knew the risks. One wrong move, and the whole operation could end in disaster. As the briefing came to an end, Mara caught Kai's eye and motioned for him to stay behind. Once the others had filed out, she crossed her arms and leaned against the table, her gaze steady.
You're coming with me,
she said, not giving him a choice. Kai raised an eyebrow.
Why? You've got enough fighters.
Because you need to see this through,
she said, her voice firm.
You've been on the edge since the last mission, and I need you focused. This will remind you why we're fighting.
Kai clenched his jaw, unsure of how to respond. He had been trying to distance himself from the fight, to find some way to keep going without losing himself completely. But Mara was right about one thing. He needed to see this through. He couldn't walk away now, not when so much was at stake.
Fine.
He said after a moment.
I'll go.
Mara gave a curt nod.
Good. We leave tonight.
The night was suffocatingly dark, the city shrouded in shadows as Kai and the other rebels made their way through the streets. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the soft sounds of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind through the decaying buildings. Kai's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the supply hub, the memories of Nico's death still fresh in his mind. This time, he promised himself, he wouldn't freeze. He would do what needed to be done. The depot loomed ahead, its massive metal gates lit by flickering floodlights. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and methodical. Kai could feel the weight of the explosives in his pack, a constant reminder of the danger they were walking into. Mara motioned for them to stop just outside the range of the lights, her hand raised as she scanned the area. After a moment, she signaled for Leela's team to move. They slipped through a gap in the fence, disappearing into the shadows as they headed for the water reserves. Kai's breath caught in his throat as he watched them go. This was it. The moment that could change everything. "Stay close," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible as she motioned for Kai and the rest of the team to follow her toward the food storage facility. They moved silently, hugging the walls of the depot as they made their way to the side entrance. Mara had picked the lock earlier in the day, and now it swung open with a soft creak, revealing a dimly lit corridor that led deeper into the building. Kai's pulse quickened as they entered, the weight of the explosives pressing against his back. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, each second dragging on longer than the last. They reached the storage area without incident, and Kai's stomach twisted at the sight of the massive crates stacked high with food. More than enough to feed the entire city for months, and yet it was hoarded here, guarded by the regime while the people starved. Mara motioned for him to set the charges. Kai moved quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the explosives along the base of the crates. The others were doing the same, moving with practiced efficiency. Everything was going smoothly, too smoothly. Just as Kai was securing the last charge, the sound of shouting echoed from the hallway. His heart dropped.
"Guards,"
Mara hissed, her eyes flashing with urgency.
"We're out of time."
Kai bolted toward the exit, Mara close behind him. The others were already moving, their footsteps a blur as they raced down the corridor, the sound of boots and gunfire closing in behind them. They reached the outside just as the first explosion rocked the depot. The ground shook beneath their feet, and flames shot into the air, lighting up the night sky. But the guards were already on them. Shots rang out, and Kai ducked behind a pile of rubble, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could see Mara ahead, her face grim as she fired back at the approaching soldiers.
"This wasn't supposed to happen,"
Kai muttered under his breath, his mind racing. They had been so close to making it out alive. Now it was all falling apart.
Chapter 7.
The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning supplies. Explosions still echoed from the depot behind them as Kai, Mara, and the remaining rebels fought their way through the streets, ducking and weaving between the rubble and broken-down buildings. The city was waking up to chaos, and sirens wailed in the distance, a haunting reminder that the regime was closing in.
"Keep moving,"
Mara shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. She fired off another round, forcing the pursuing soldiers to scatter. Kai's chest burned as he ran, his legs trembling from exhaustion. His mind was still reeling from the mission's collapse. Everything had been planned so carefully, but the guards had been waiting for them almost as if they knew they were coming. And now, with the depot in flames, it was only a matter of time before the regime retaliated. They slipped through a narrow alleyway, the sound of footsteps growing more distant behind them. Mara led them toward one of the hidden tunnels that ran beneath the city, a network of passages the rebels used to move without being detected. As soon as they reached the entrance, she shoved open the metal grate, and they scrambled inside, breathing heavily. Kai collapsed against the wall of the tunnel, his chest heaving. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. They had destroyed the food stores, but the mission had gone wrong in every other way. Leela's team hadn't made it back yet. Kai didn't know if they were dead, captured, or still trying to escape. The fear gnawed at him. They had lost people before, but something about this mission felt different. Worse. Mara slammed the grate shut behind them, her face grim as she surveyed the remaining rebels.
"We got what we came for,"
she said, her voice hard.
"but this was a close call. Too close."
Someone must have tipped them off.
One of the rebels muttered, his voice tight with frustration.
There's no way they could have known we were coming unless...
Mara's gaze snapped to him, her eyes narrowing.
"Unless what?"
The rebel swallowed hard, clearly intimidated by her, but he didn't back down.
Unless someone inside our group told them.
A heavy silence settled over the group. The idea of a traitor among them was unthinkable, but the way the mission had been compromised suggested something more than bad luck. Kai shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. He hadn't wanted to believe it, but part of him had suspected the same thing. The guards had been waiting for them, too well prepared, and it wasn't the first time something had gone wrong on a mission. Nico's death, Leela's injury, the failed sabotage, all of it felt too coincidental. Mara's face darkened, but she kept her voice calm.
"We don't have time for accusations right now. We need to regroup and figure out our next move. We'll deal with this later."
Kai's unease only deepened. He glanced around the group, trying to gauge the reactions of the other rebels. He didn't know who to trust anymore, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed heavily on him. They didn't have to wait long for news of Layla's team. Just a few hours after they made it back to the base, Leela stumbled through the entrance, limping heavily and covered in dust and blood. She wasn't alone. One of the other rebels, Jade, supported her, her face tight with pain. Mara rushed to them as soon as they arrived.
"What happened?"
she asked, her voice sharp with worry. Leela winced, her hand clutching her side where blood soaked through her shirt.
"It was a setup,"
she said through gritted teeth.
"The guards knew we were coming. We barely made it out alive."
Mara's expression hardened. She exchanged a glance with Kai, and he knew what she was thinking. Someone had betrayed them. The question was, who? Kai felt the knot of dread in his stomach tighten. The rebellion had been his only hope after losing Lena, but now even this felt fragile, on the verge of falling apart. If there was a traitor in their ranks, everything they had fought for could be destroyed.
"We need to talk,"
Mara said, her voice low as she pulled Leela and Jade aside. Kai watched them go, his mind swirling with doubt and anger. He wanted answers. He needed to know who had sold them out. Tension in the rebel camp was palpable in the days following the failed attack. The air was thick with suspicion, and whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Every glance felt loaded, every conversation a potential accusation. Mara's leadership was being questioned more openly now. Some rebels began to wonder whether she had lost her edge. Kai had never seen the group so fractured. It had been different when he first joined. There had been a sense of purpose, a unity born out of shared suffering and a common enemy. But now, everything felt uncertain. The rebels had suffered too many losses, and each new death only deepened the cracks in their resolve. One night, as Kai sat alone in the dim light of the underground base, Leela approached him, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. Her wound hadn't fully healed, but she was back on her feet, pushing herself harder than ever.
"We need to talk,"
she said, her voice quiet but firm. Kai looked up at her, feeling a strange sense of relief. He had been waiting for this conversation, knowing that Leela had seen the same things he had during the mission, The way everything had gone wrong so quickly, the way it felt like they were being led into a trap.
Do you think someone's betraying us?
He asked bluntly, not bothering with pleasantries. Leela sat down beside him, letting out a long breath.
I don't know,
She admitted.
but something isn't right. We've been making too many mistakes lately. The regime always seems to be one step ahead.
Kai nodded, his fists clenched at his sides.
Who could it be? Mara?
Leela shook her head.
No, I don't think it's her. She's too invested in this, but there's something she's not telling us.
Kai frowned, the unease in his chest growing stronger.
Like what?
Leela hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening.
There are rumors,
She said quietly.
I've heard some of the others talking. They say Mara's been making deals with people outside the city. Wealthy, powerful people who could help the rebellion. But some think those deals might come with strings attached.
Kai felt his blood run cold. Deals? With the same kind of people they were fighting against? The idea seemed impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Mara had always been focused on the long game, on survival above all else. But what if her version of survival meant compromising the very ideals they were fighting for?
What do you think we should do?
Kai asked, his voice tense. Leela met his gaze, her eyes hard.
We need to find out the truth. If there's a traitor, we have to expose them before the whole rebellion falls apart.
The next few days were spent quietly gathering information. Kai and Leela worked together, moving carefully through the ranks of the rebels, listening for any hint of who might be feeding information to the regime. It was a dangerous game. If they were wrong, or if someone caught on, they could be branded traitors themselves. But the more they dug, the more unsettling things became. Late one night, Kai stumbled upon something he hadn't expected. While searching Mara's quarters for anything suspicious, he found a series of encrypted messages, hidden in a small compartment beneath her desk. The messages were short but damning. References to meetings with outside contacts, promises of support in exchange for something vague, something Kai couldn't quite decipher. His heart raced as he stared at the screen. This was it. Proof that Mara had been hiding something. But what did it mean? Was she working with the regime? Or was there something even more sinister at play? As Kai pocketed the device, ready to confront Leela with the evidence, a shadow moved in the doorway. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was Mara. She stood there, her eyes dark and unreadable as she looked at him.
I see you've been busy,
She said, her voice dangerously calm. Kai's pulse quickened. He had been caught. And now he was about to learn the truth.
Chapter 8.
The air in Mara's quarters was thick with tension. Kai stood frozen, clutching the device in his hand, while Mara's eyes bore into him, dark and unreadable. Her calm, almost casual demeanor unnerved him. He'd expected her to be angry, or at least defensive, but she just stared at him, as if waiting for him to make the first move.
You've been snooping,
Mara said, her voice smooth, almost amused. Kai's pulse raced, but he didn't back down. He tightened his grip on the device, the encrypted messages still burning in his mind.
You've been lying to us.
He said, his voice low but firm.
What are these deals you've been making?
Mara didn't answer right away. She stepped into the room, shutting the door behind her with a soft click.
It's more complicated than you think,
She said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the desk.
I've done what's necessary to keep the rebellion alive.
Necessary?
Kai spat, his anger rising.
You've been making deals with the same people who hoard food and water while the rest of us starve. How is that necessary?
Mara's expression didn't change, but her eyes flashed with something cold.
You don't understand what we are up against. This isn't just about fighting the regime. It's about survival. We're running out of time. And if we don't make alliances, we'll be crushed. The regime is too powerful to take down without help.
Help?
Kai repeated, incredulous.
From who? The same people who rigged the lottery so they never get chosen? The same people who let Lena die?
Mara's gaze hardened at the mention of Lena, but she didn't flinch.
Yes, from them. The elites have power, resources, and connections that we need. They can help us take down the regime.
Kai's stomach churned. The thought of working with the same people who had destroyed his life, who had destroyed countless lives, made his blood boil.
You're betraying everything we fought for.
I'm making sure we win.
Mara shot back, her voice sharp now.
You think this fight is about justice, Kai? It's not. It's about survival. And if we want to survive, we have to be willing to do whatever it takes.
Kai shook his head, disbelief washing over him. He had joined the rebellion because he thought they were different, because he believed they were fighting for something real, something worth dying for. But now it felt like everything was unraveling.
You're selling us out.
He said, his voice trembling with anger.
All of us.
Mara's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked.
I'm saving you,
she hissed.
The regime is on the verge of collapsing, but they're not going down without a fight. If we don't make alliances now, we'll all be dead before the year is out.
Kai took a step back, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Mara right? Was there no other way to win? Or was she leading them into the very system they were trying to destroy? His thoughts were interrupted by the blaring of an alarm. The sharp, piercing sound echoed through the tunnels, making his heart skip a beat. Mara's expression shifted immediately, the cold determination in her eyes returning.
It's the lottery,
she said, her voice tight.
They've called another one.
Kai's blood turned to ice. Another lottery. Another 20 lives about to be taken. He thought of Lena, her name being read aloud in the square, the look of fear in her eyes as they dragged her away. The rage that had simmered inside him for so long flared again, burning hot and bright.
This is why we're fighting.
Kai said, his voice hoarse.
To stop this. To stop them.
Mara's eyes flickered with something. Was it regret? But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared.
If you want to stop them,
she said,
then you'll do what I say.
Kai didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, his anger battling his fear, his doubt clashing with his desire for justice. But as the alarms continued to blare, one thing became clear. The regime was tightening its grip, and the rebellion was hanging by a thread. Whatever happened next, Kai knew he couldn't trust Mara. Not anymore. The streets were packed by the time Kai made it to the city square. The alarms had drawn everyone out of their homes, filling the square with anxious, fearful faces. The massive screen loomed over the crowd, flickering to life with the city's emblem, a cracked sun over barren mountains. The sight made Kai's stomach turn. He pushed through the crowd, scanning the faces around him. He spotted Dax near the edge of the square, standing with a group of other rebels, his face pale and tense. Kai hadn't spoken to Dax since the failed mission. He didn't know if Dax had heard the rumors about a traitor, but the fear in his friend's eyes told him that trust was eroding everywhere. The crowd fell silent as the screen shifted to show the face of Governor Gerard, the man who controlled everything. His sharp, polished features stood out against the gray backdrop, his expression cold and detached as always.
Citizens,
Gerard began, his voice amplified through the speakers.
Today we honor the next 20 who will make the ultimate sacrifice for the survival of our great city. The lottery is not a punishment, but a necessary measure to ensure that our limited resources are preserved for those who will continue to rebuild our society.
Kai clenched his fists at his sides, bile rising in his throat. He had heard this speech before. Every citizen had. It was the same hollow justification for murder, repeated week after week.
As always, we thank those brave individuals for their service.
Gerard continued, his expression unchanged.
Their contributions will never be forgotten.
The screen shifted again, this time displaying a long list of names. The mechanical voice began reading them aloud, each one sending a jolt of dread through the crowd. Kai stood still, his heart pounding in his chest as the names rolled on. Each name was a death sentence, another life snuffed out by a system that cared more about maintaining control than saving people. Then he heard it.
Kai Renford.
The world seemed to stop. His breath caught in his throat, his mind going blank. The name echoed through the square like a death knell, the crowd around him blurring into a sea of faceless bodies.
Kai Renford.
His name. He had been chosen. The moment the voice finished reading his name, panic set in. Kai's mind raced, his body frozen in shock. This couldn't be happening. He had survived so many lotteries, but now it was his turn. The system had finally caught up with him. Dax was beside him in an instant, grabbing his arm.
Kai, we have to go,
he said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper.
They'll be coming for you.
Kai nodded numbly, his legs moving on autopilot as Dax pulled him through the crowd. The reality of it hadn't fully sunk in yet. He was running, but part of him still couldn't believe what was happening. The square was swarming with soldiers now, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency, collecting the chosen. Kai's heart raced as he and Dax ducked into an alley, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of boots on pavement grew louder behind them.
We need to get to the tunnels.
Dax muttered, his grip on Kai's arm tightening.
It's the only way out.
They moved quickly through the narrow streets, keeping to the shadows. Kai's mind was a blur of fear and disbelief. How had this happened? Why had his name been chosen? Was it random? Or had someone set him up? As they neared the tunnel entrance, Kai's thoughts shifted to Mara. She had known something was coming. Was this part of her plan? Was this how she dealt with anyone who questioned her leadership? Before Kai could process any of it, they reached the entrance to the underground tunnels. Dax shoved open the grate, and they slipped inside, disappearing into the darkness just as the soldiers rounded the corner.
Chapter 9.
The air in the tunnel was damp and cold, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Kai and Dax moved quickly through the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Every sound, every distant rumble of footsteps, sent a jolt of fear through Kai's body. He had always feared the lottery, but now, with his name on the list, it felt like death was closing in on him, tightening its grip with every second.
I can't believe they called my name.
Kai muttered, his voice hoarse. The reality of it was still settling in. 1 minute he was just another rebel, another face in the crowd, and the next he was marked for execution.
They know you've been involved with us.
Dax said, his tone grim.
Once you're on their radar, they'll use any excuse to get rid of you. I've seen it happen before.
Kai shook his head, his thoughts racing.
It's not just that,
he said quietly, remembering his conversation with Mara, the encrypted messages, the sense that something deeper was going on.
I think this was planned. I think Mara knew this was going to happen.
Dax glanced at him sharply as they rounded a corner, their pace never slowing.
What are you saying? Mara's been making deals.
Kai explained, his voice tight with frustration.
I found messages. She's working with people outside the city, the elites. I think she set me up.
Dax frowned, but there was no time for a longer conversation. The tunnel ahead branched off in several directions, each one leading to different sectors of the underground network. Dax stopped for a moment, scanning the walls.
We need to split up,
he said finally.
If they track us down here, we'll have a better chance if we're not together.
Kai's stomach twisted at the thought of being alone, but he knew Dax was right. The regime was relentless, and if they found them together, it was over.
Where will you go?
He asked, his voice tight.
I'll head towards the southern tunnels,
Dax said, already moving toward the nearest passage.
I'll see if I can get to one of our safe houses. You should do the same. Find somewhere to lie low. Stay off the grid until this blows over.
Kai hesitated, his mind racing.
What about Mara? I need answers.
Dax stopped, turning back to face him.
You're not seriously thinking about going back to her, are you? After everything that's happened? I have to know the truth.
Kai insisted.
If she set me up, if she's been working with the elites, we're all in danger.
Dax's expression softened, a mix of concern and frustration flashing across his face.
Be careful, Kai.
He said quietly.
Mara's dangerous. If she finds out what you know, you might not make it out of there alive.
Kai nodded, knowing the risk was real. But he couldn't run forever. He had to confront Mara, had to understand why she had betrayed them, why she had betrayed him. Without another word, Dax turned and disappeared into the southern tunnel, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Kai stood there for a moment alone, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. The underground base was eerily quiet when Kai arrived. Most of the rebels had scattered after the lottery announcement, either lying low or preparing for the next move. But Mara was still there, waiting in her quarters, as if she knew he would come. Kai entered without knocking, his body tense with adrenaline. Mara stood by the window, staring out into the dimly lit tunnels, her back to him. She didn't turn when he entered, but her voice cut through the silence.
I thought you might come back.
Kai's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his ears.
You knew my name was going to be called,
He said, his voice low but full of barely restrained anger.
You knew, and you let it happen.
Mara turned slowly, her expression unreadable.
I warned you,
She said calmly.
This is war, Kai. Sacrifices have to be made.
Sacrifices?
Kai spat, stepping closer.
You're playing both sides, working with the elites, while you send us to die. How many more are you planning to sacrifice?
Mara's gaze hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest.
You don't understand the bigger picture.
I don't need to understand your twisted version of survival.
Kai shot back.
You're selling us out. You're no better than the regime.
Mara's eyes flashed with anger, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked.
You think this fight is black and white? That we can just tear down the regime and walk away? It's not that simple, Kai. The elites control everything. Resources, technology, power. If we don't make alliances, we'll be crushed. I'm doing what's necessary to keep us alive.
Alive?
Kai echoed, his voice shaking.
You're choosing who gets to live and who dies. You're no different from the regime, deciding who's worthy of survival.
Mara took a step forward, her eyes cold and unyielding.
You're naive if you think we can win this fight without playing their game. The only way to beat them is to join them. Get inside, take their power, and use it against them. You don't have the stomach for that? Then you don't belong here.
Kai's breath caught in his throat. Everything he had believed about the rebellion, everything he had fought for, suddenly felt hollow. Mara wasn't leading a revolution. She was playing a dangerous game of manipulation and survival, sacrificing her own people to secure her place among the elites.
What are you going to do with me?
Kai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara's gaze didn't waver.
I wasn't going to let you die in the lottery. I had plans for you.
Kai frowned, confusion clouding his mind.
What plans?
Mara's lips curled into a small, bitter smile.
You're valuable, Kai. The elites are looking for fighters like you, people who can be useful. They'll take you in, train you, and you'll have power. More than you ever imagined.
Kai's stomach twisted. The offer sounded more like a trap than an opportunity.
You think I want to be part of their system? To be used by them?
You don't have a choice,
Mara said bluntly.
This is the only way out.
Kai took a step back, his mind racing. He had seen too many people die. Too many lives destroyed by the very system Mara was now trying to join. And now she was offering him a place in that system, as if it was some kind of reward.
No.
Kai said firmly.
I'm not doing this.
Mara's expression darkened.
Then you'll die.
Kai didn't wait for her to make the first move. He bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Mara shouting behind him, but he didn't stop. He ran through the tunnels, his mind racing, the weight of everything crashing down on him. Kai didn't stop running until he reached one of the lower tunnels, far away from the rebel base. He collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The conversation with Mara echoed in his mind, and the weight of what he had learned settled over him like a heavy shroud. The rebellion was a lie. Or at least, it wasn't what he thought it was. Mara had been manipulating them all from the beginning, working with the elites to secure power for herself. The lottery, the sacrifices, they were all part of her twisted plan to get inside the regime's inner circle. And now she had offered him a place in that system, as if his loyalty could be bought with power. But Kai knew better now. He had seen what the elites were capable of, how they used people like pawns in their endless game of control. And he refused to be part of it. He had to do something. But what? The rebellion was crumbling from the inside, and Mara's influence was spreading. If she wasn't stopped, the entire city would fall under her control, and the elites would continue to tighten their grip on the people. As he sat there in the darkness, a realization dawned on him. The only way to stop the regime was to stop the rebellion.
Chapter 10.
Kai's mind raced as he sat in the darkness of the tunnel, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. Mara had betrayed them all. The rebellion wasn't about overthrowing the regime, it was about power. Mara was working with the elites, playing both sides to secure her place in a new order, where only the powerful survived. And now she had offered Kai a place in that twisted game. But Kai couldn't be part of it. Not after everything he had seen. Lena's death, Nico's sacrifice, the suffering of the people, it all meant nothing if the rebellion was just another arm of the regime. He had to stop her. But how? The rebels were fractured, the regime was closing in, and Kai was a marked man. He didn't have many options. But he did have one chance left. The explosives. Kai had seen them in the underground base, stockpiled for future attacks. If he could get his hands on them, he could destroy everything. The regime's infrastructure, the supply chains, and the rebel base itself. He would bring it all crashing down. If the rebellion couldn't be trusted, then neither could the regime. Both systems had to be broken. The only question was whether he was willing to go through with it. Kai stood slowly, his body aching from exhaustion. He didn't have much time. The regime would be hunting him now, and Mara would be looking for him too. If he wanted to take them both down, he had to act quickly. Kai made his way through the winding tunnels, keeping to the shadows as he approached the rebel base. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Could he really do this? Could he destroy everything? The only chance at resistance against the regime? Or was it better to let Mara continue, even if her methods were twisted? No, Kai couldn't let her win. Not after everything she had done. Not after all the lives that had been lost. He reached the base undetected, slipping inside through one of the hidden entrances. The place was quieter than usual. Most of the rebels were out preparing for their next move, leaving only a few guards behind. Kai moved quickly, making his way to the storage room where the explosives were kept. His heart raced as he carefully gathered the charges, placing them in a pack on his back. He knew he had to be precise. The charges would need to be planted in key areas, structural points that would cause the entire base to collapse, along with any nearby government infrastructure. The blast would be devastating, enough to cripple both the regime's supply chain and Mara's rebel faction. It would be chaos. But maybe that was what the city needed, a chance to rebuild from the ashes. Just as Kai finished securing the last charge, the door behind him creaked open. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. It was Mara. She stood in the doorway, her expression cold and unreadable, her eyes flicking between Kai and the pack of explosives at his feet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged with tension, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the silence.
I knew you'd come back.
Mara said finally, her voice low and calm.
You couldn't stay away.
Kai's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move.
I'm ending this.
He said, his voice steady.
Both the regime and your rebellion.
Mara's eyes flashed with something dark. Anger, perhaps, or something deeper.
You don't know what you're doing, Kai,
she said, taking a step closer.
If you destroy this base, you destroy the only hope that people have left. The regime will win. They'll crush anyone who stands in their way.
They've already won.
Kai shot back, his fists clenched at his sides.
You're just playing into their hands. You sold us out, Mara. You made deals with the very people we're supposed to be fighting against.
Mara's lips curled into a bitter smile.
You're a fool if you think you can change the system by destroying it. The regime is too powerful. The only way to win is to get inside and use their power against them. That's what I've been doing. You are too blind to see it.
I see what you're doing,
Kai said, his voice trembling with anger.
You're sacrificing innocent people. You're no different from them.
Mara's eyes narrowed, her calm facade slipping.
You don't understand. I've been fighting for years, longer than you've been alive. This is how the world works. You want justice. You want freedom. It doesn't exist, Kai. Not in a world like this.
Kai felt his blood boil. Every word she said twisted the knife deeper.
Then I'll burn it all down,
he said quietly, his voice hard. Mara's expression darkened.
You'll destroy everything.
That's the point.
Without another word, Kai reached for the detonator, his hand shaking as he activated the timer on the explosives. He had only minutes before the charges would go off, leveling the base and everything around it. Mara's eyes widened with fury.
You don't know what you're doing,
she shouted, lunging toward him. But Kai was faster. He slipped past her, bolting out of the storage room and down the narrow corridor, the sound of Mara's footsteps close behind. His heart pounded in his ears as he raced through the base, the timer ticking down in his mind. Kai burst out of the base just as the first explosion rocked the ground beneath him. The force of the blast threw him forward, sending him tumbling to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing as flames shot into the sky, consuming the base and everything within it. He stood there, breathing heavily, watching as the rebel base, Mara's empire, collapsed in on itself. The flames reflected in his eyes, the heat washing over him like a wave. It was done. But even as the fire roared around him, something didn't feel right. The explosion should have taken out more of the nearby infrastructure, more of the regime's supply lines. But the damage was confined to the rebel base, as if the charges had been placed with precision to target only the rebellion. Kai's heart sank. He had been played. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He staggered, clutching his ribs, and turned to see Mara standing behind him, bloodied but still alive. She held a small remote in her hand, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and triumph.
I told you,
she said, her voice weak but defiant.
You don't know the game you're playing.
Kai's vision blurred as he realized the truth. Mara had always been one step ahead. The explosives had been rigged to take out the rebellion, not the regime. The elites had orchestrated the entire thing from the lottery that selected his name to the final destruction of the rebels. He had been their pawn all along. As the world around him burned, Kai sank to his knees, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. The rebellion was gone. The regime remained, and he had been used to destroy the only chance the people had of fighting back. Mara's voice echoed in his ears, her final words cutting through the smoke and chaos.
You're either part of the system, or you're dead.